The night was quiet, the kind of silence that only wide, open land can hold. The wind moved through the dry grass like a whisper from another world. A lonely cowboy sat by a fading fire, his hat pulled low, the light catching the dust on his boots. His horse stood a few feet away, still and tired as if it shared his thoughts. The stars above him didn't twinkle, they just stared down, cold and distant, reminding him how small he really was. He had spent weeks riding across the plains, chasing work, chasing something he couldn't name. Maybe peace, maybe memory, maybe someone to talk to. Every night he spoke to his horse or the sky, but tonight the silence felt heavier. It pressed on his chest until words escaped his mouth without him meaning to say them. "Can you act as my wife tonight?" His voice was low, cracked, like it had been buried for years. He hadn't planned to say that. It wasn't a line, not a joke. It was a plea, born from a heart that had forgotten the sound of laughter and the warmth of another's soul. A few yards away stood a woman, strong, calm, her presence quiet but powerful. Her skin glowed softly in the firelight, her eyes steady, like she was used to storms and solitude. She was a native woman from a nearby tribe, and she had come looking for something too. Maybe food, maybe peace, maybe answers of her own. When she heard his words, her brows lifted. She didn't move closer, didn't step back either. The cowboy looked up at her, his eyes carrying more stories than words ever could. He didn't mean marriage, not really. He meant company. He meant someone to remind him he still existed. The land had taken everything from him, time, love, laughter, and left only the ache of loneliness. For a moment they just looked at each other, the fire crackling softly between them. The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp but impossible to ignore. The woman felt the weight of his voice, the truth behind it. He wasn't asking for love. He was asking not to feel alone, at least for one night. And in that strange moment, something began to shift in the air, like the world had paused to listen to what might happen next. The cowboy's life was not the kind people sang about in old songs. It wasn't all glory, adventure, and sunsets. Most days were a test of patience, hunger, and silence. He had been riding for weeks, moving from one empty town to the next, searching for work that barely paid enough to fill his saddlebag. Every morning he woke up to the same cold air, the same creaking saddle, and the same endless stretch of land that looked no different from the day before. The plains had no mercy. They gave nothing and took everything slowly. He had grown used to the sound of hooves and wind, the clinking of his spurs, and the low groan of his horse's breath. They were the only voices that stayed with him. Sometimes he tried to remember what laughter sounded like, but it had been too long. The last time he had heard a woman's voice was in a town miles away, and even then it had been just a greeting, nothing more. He wasn't the kind of man people noticed anymore. Dust and distance had erased his name, leaving only the shape of a man trying to keep going. Loneliness had a way of sneaking up on him. It didn't come all at once. It came in quiet moments, when the fire died down, when the wind stopped blowing, when his thoughts grew louder than the night itself. He tried to fight it at first. He told himself that cowboys didn't need anyone, that being alone was part of the job. But the truth was, even the toughest hearts could crack when the silence grew too heavy. He wasn't always like this. Once he had a reason to come home. A woman with kind eyes, a small house by the river, a dream of growing old together. But dreams die faster than they grow in this land. A sickness took her before the spring came. The house rotted. The river dried. And he left because staying would have killed him too. Since then, he'd been chasing the road, thinking movement would ease the pain. But pain doesn't disappear when you move. It rides with you. It becomes your shadow. He didn't talk about her anymore. The memory had turned quiet like an old scar. Yet on some nights her face would flash through his mind and it made him restless. He would stare at the stars, wondering if she could see the same ones from wherever souls go when they're done here. And when the ache got too strong, he would talk out loud, pretending someone was listening. Most of the time, no one was. That evening, the wind had died down, and the stillness of the night pressed against him like a blanket too heavy to move. He could hear every crack in the fire, every breath his horse took. He felt the loneliness thick in the air, like smoke that wouldn't clear. His mind began to wander again, tracing old memories and half-formed wishes. That's when he saw her, the native woman, standing at a distance. He didn't know how long she'd been there. Maybe she had been watching quietly, or maybe the land itself had sent her. She stood tall, her presence calm but strong, her gaze fixed on him. For a second he thought she was a ghost, a trick of his tired eyes. But the longer he looked, the more real she became, flesh, breath, and mystery. She carried herself differently from anyone he had met. There was no fear in her stance, no curiosity either. She looked like someone who had seen too much to be easily surprised. The air between them was still, charged with something he couldn't name. He opened his mouth, but no words came at first. His throat felt dry, like dust had built up inside him from years of silence. When he finally spoke, the words stumbled out before he could stop them. "Can you act as my wife tonight?" He wasn't sure what he meant when he said it. It wasn't a request for touch or comfort, not really. It was a plea to feel human again, to share warmth, to hear a voice that wasn't his own, to pretend, even for a few hours, that he wasn't invisible. He felt foolish the moment the words left his mouth. He expected her to turn away, to walk back into the darkness. But she didn't move. Her eyes stayed on him, unreadable, deep as river water. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing a quiet strength he couldn't look away from. She didn't speak right away. The silence between them stretched long enough for him to hear his own heartbeat. He lowered his eyes, ashamed, thinking maybe he had said too much, asked too much. But still, something inside him hoped she'd understand what he couldn't explain. Because the truth was, the cowboy wasn't begging for a wife. He was begging for a moment of connection. He wanted someone to look at him and see more than a drifter or a stranger. He wanted to feel that the world still held warmth, that kindness hadn't vanished completely. In that moment, he wasn't a cowboy or a wanderer or a man made of dust and silence. He was just human, tired, broken, but still hoping. The fire crackled softly, throwing small sparks into the night sky as if even the flames were listening. The woman took a slow breath, her expression still calm. Her world was different from his, richer, rooted in family, in land, in stories told under the same stars. She could see his pain even if he didn't speak it. And maybe, just maybe, she knew what it meant to be alone too. The night around them seemed to hold its breath. The land was vast, empty, and endless, yet in that one small circle of firelight, two souls had found each other. The cowboy didn't know what she would say, and for the first time in a long time he was afraid to find out. But he stayed still, waiting, because something deep inside him whispered that this moment might change everything, even if only for a night. The woman's silence wasn't cold, it was thoughtful. She had learned to measure words, to weigh them before they left her mouth. In her world, words carried spirit. They could heal, or they could wound. She stood still, her dark hair brushing against her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the stranger who had just asked her something no man ever had. The firelight moved across her face, revealing the strength written in every line. She looked calm, but inside her thoughts were restless, circling like birds over a wide valley. She had seen many men like him before, wanderers, soldiers, drifters. Men who came through the plains carrying hunger in their eyes. Some wanted food, some wanted trade, and some wanted to forget. But this one was different. His voice wasn't demanding. It wasn't proud. It was tired and cracked, like the sound of a branch breaking in the wind. There was something behind his question that she couldn't ignore, a quiet pain, a human ache she knew too well. Her people had taught her to be cautious of outsiders. They came with promises and left with regrets. They brought gifts and took land. They spoke softly and disappeared when storms came. So when she heard him speak, her first instinct was to walk away, to turn her back on him and let the night swallow his words. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way his eyes didn't look at her with hunger, only with hope. Maybe it was because, deep down, she too understood what it meant to be alone. Her village was a few miles north, tucked between the trees near the river. She had left at sunset to gather herbs, her small pouch now full of roots and leaves. She wasn't supposed to linger this far, but the quiet had called her here. The stars had always been her companions, silent but steady. They reminded her of her ancestors, of the old songs her mother used to sing by the fire. Yet tonight, even the stars felt distant. She thought about the cowboy's words again. "Can you act as my wife tonight?" The question rolled through her mind like thunder echoing in the hills. He hadn't said it with lust or command. He had said it like a man who had forgotten what warmth felt like. She wondered what kind of life left a person so empty that they'd ask a stranger for comfort. She studied him quietly. His clothes were worn, his hands rough and scarred. His eyes told her more than his words did. They carried miles of dust, memories, and mistakes. Yet there was something gentle in them too, something fragile that didn't fit with his rough edges. He was the kind of man who looked like he'd fought the world and lost but still kept standing. She could have left. Her people would have said she should. They would tell her not to trust him, not to let pity cloud her judgment. But her heart was not made of stone. She had lost people too. Her husband had gone to war and never returned. Her father had died defending the land. Loneliness had crept into her life like a slow fire, silent, invisible, and hard to put out. She had learned to hide it well, to bury it under work and duty. But tonight, standing before this cowboy, she felt it again, sharp and sudden. The cowboy's eyes flickered up to meet hers. He didn't speak again, afraid that another word might break the fragile air between them. She could see he was ready to be rejected. Maybe he was even used to it. She wondered how many nights he had sat alone by a fire like this, talking to the wind, hoping someone would answer. She didn't pity him. She respected him for asking. It took courage to show weakness in a world that rewarded only strength. She stepped a little closer, not enough to bridge the distance, but enough to let him know she wasn't afraid. The faint scent of sage drifted from her clothes, mingling with the smell of smoke. She spoke softly, her voice steady. "Why me?" she asked. It wasn't anger in her tone, it was curiosity. The cowboy blinked, startled. For a moment he didn't know how to answer. Then he swallowed hard, his voice low and rough. "Because you look like someone who listens," he said, "and I haven't been heard in a long time." His honesty hung between them, heavy but pure. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she looked at the fire, watching the embers break apart and fade into the air. She understood him more than she wanted to admit. Listening was a gift her people valued, and she had always been good at it. But she also knew that listening came with a price. It opened your heart to someone else's pain. In the distance, an owl called out, and the night seemed to deepen. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the stillness. She thought of her ancestors, of their teachings, how every soul carried its own story, how kindness was a circle that always came back. Maybe this meeting wasn't an accident. Maybe the spirits had sent her here for a reason. She opened her eyes again, her gaze softer now. The cowboy hadn't moved. His face was lined with exhaustion, but there was a flicker of hope there, a small flame refusing to die. She felt that same flicker in herself, and it scared her. She didn't want to care, but something about his brokenness made her want to. She took another step forward, slow and careful, until the firelight touched her completely. The cowboy looked up, his breath catching as if afraid she'd vanish. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I don't know what kind of woman you think I am," she said, "but if you want someone to listen, I can do that." The cowboy nodded once, his throat tightening. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He just looked at her with gratitude too deep for words. The fire popped softly between them, and for the first time that night, the air didn't feel empty. The space around them felt alive, as if the land itself had exhaled. Two strangers, both haunted by silence, now shared the same small circle of warmth. Neither of them knew what the night would bring. They only knew that for a moment, neither had to be alone anymore. The fire burned low, its glow soft and steady, painting both faces in amber light. The cowboy sat with his back straight, though his body begged for rest. The woman knelt across from him, her hands folded loosely in her lap, the faint rhythm of her breathing calm and certain. The land around them stretched into darkness, silent except for the distant howl of a coyote and the quiet pop of burning wood. For a long while neither spoke. They didn't need to. The quiet between them was heavy but not empty. It was full of things neither had yet found words for. He looked at her through the smoke. Her eyes didn't flinch, didn't drift away from his. They were sharp, clear, alive. He felt small under that gaze, like she could see the parts of him he'd buried long ago. He wanted to explain himself, to make his strange question sound less foolish, but no explanation came. The truth was simple, and maybe that was why it felt so hard to say. He was lonely. Not the kind of lonely that comes from a quiet night or a long ride, but the kind that builds inside a man until it becomes a second skin. The woman broke the silence first. "You've been on the trail a long time," she said softly, not as a question but as a truth she already knew. He nodded. "Feels like all my life." His voice was rough, like gravel. "Riding, sleeping under the sky, talking to no one but my horse." He glanced at her with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You start to forget what people sound like after a while." She tilted her head slightly. "And you think pretending I'm your wife will fix that?" He didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, watching the embers shift and fall. "No," he said at last, "it won't fix it. But maybe it'll make it quiet for a while." His honesty surprised her. Most men she'd met spoke in riddles or pride, covering their pain with loud words. But he didn't hide. His words were plain and bare, like his life. She found that honesty disarming. Dangerous, even. Because it stirred something in her that she had buried under years of silence too, sympathy. The wind stirred the grass around them, carrying the smell of sage and smoke. The cowboy reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a tin cup. "You can sit," he said quietly. "There's coffee. It ain't much, but it's warm." She hesitated. It wasn't the drink that made her pause, it was the meaning behind it. Sharing food or drink was sacred in her culture. It meant trust. It meant you accepted someone's presence, even for a moment. But something about his tone felt harmless, almost humble. She took the cup, her fingers brushing his for a heartbeat. The touch startled them both. It wasn't romantic. It was electric, alive, a reminder that they were still human. The warmth spread through her hands as she sipped. The coffee was bitter and rough, like the man who made it. But it steadied her, anchored her in the moment. He watched her quietly, the way a man might watch a sunrise he didn't expect to see again. There was no greed in his eyes, no hunger, just the faint light of gratitude. "You live alone?" he asked. She nodded. "Since my husband died." The words came simply, without hesitation, but they hung in the air like smoke. He lowered his gaze, nodding slowly, respectful. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Don't be," she replied. "He died with honor, protecting what was ours." Her voice didn't waver. "I stayed. Someone had to." He looked at her then, really looked. He saw strength not loud or proud, but quiet, rooted deep like an old tree. He envied it. "You're braver than me," he said. Her lips curved slightly, not in amusement but in disbelief. "You think walking alone through this land isn't brave?" she asked. "You face storms, hunger, bandits, and still you stand." He shook his head. "That's not bravery," he said softly. "That's just surviving." The word struck her. She understood that difference all too well. Surviving was something she knew, like breathing, necessary but never easy. Maybe that's why she hadn't walked away yet. Something in his voice matched something inside her, that quiet, aching fight to keep going when there's nothing left to hold on to. She placed the cup down beside her and looked at him again. "Why tonight?" she asked. "What made you ask me?" He took a breath, long and shaky. "Because tonight felt heavier," he said, "like the sky forgot how to breathe." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I saw you standing there and you looked real. Like you belonged to this world. And he paused, searching for the words. "I just wanted to feel like I belonged too." She said nothing, but her eyes softened. The honesty in his voice broke through every wall she had built. She had seen men beg before, for food, for gold, for power, but this was different. He was begging for something invisible, something simple, a place in the world, even if only for a night. A long silence followed. The flames whispered between them, sparks rising and dying in the dark. Finally, she moved closer, just enough for her shadow to touch his. "You don't need me to act as your wife," she said. "You need someone to see you." He looked up, meeting her gaze, his eyes shining faintly in the firelight. "And do you?" he asked. Her answer came quiet but steady. "I see a man who's tired, a man who's lost more than he can name, a man who's still searching." He swallowed hard, his chest tight. For a moment he couldn't speak. The words hit something inside him he'd locked away years ago. He hadn't realized how much he wanted to be seen, not as a cowboy, not as a wanderer, but as a man. The night deepened. The stars shifted above them, their light falling gently across the plain. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a small bundle of sage, tossing it into the fire. A clean, earthy scent rose up, curling through the air. "For peace," she said. The cowboy nodded. The fire crackled louder, almost as if it approved. They sat there, side by side, neither speaking, neither needing to. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't hurt. It felt right. It felt shared. The land around them was vast, but for that single moment it felt smaller, like it had folded itself around the two of them, protecting what was fragile but real. The cowboy watched the flames dance, his hands steady now. The woman stared into the distance, her heart calm. They didn't know what the next moment would bring, but they both understood one thing clearly. In this wide, empty world, something had changed. Something had begun to breathe again. The night settled around them like a blanket, soft, dark, and endless. The fire had burned low, now only a bed of glowing coals breathing in the quiet. A faint wind drifted through, carrying the smell of sage and smoke. The woman sat still, her eyes following the orange glow as if reading stories in the embers. The cowboy leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely together. Neither of them spoke. There was comfort in the silence, but also a question still hanging in the air, unfinished and waiting. He wanted to speak, to fill the space with words, but he was afraid to ruin the peace. She had stayed, she hadn't walked away after his strange request, and that meant more than he could explain. For years, people had left him behind, friends, lovers, even the land itself. Everything he touched seemed to fade or drift away. But this woman, she stayed. Her presence was steady like the earth itself. He felt it in the way she breathed, in the way her gaze didn't wander. She turned to him finally, her voice soft. "You said you just wanted quiet," she said. "But quiet doesn't fix a lonely heart, it only hides it." Her words cut deep, but not cruelly. He nodded slowly. "Maybe, but sometimes hiding it is the only way to survive." He looked at his hands, rough and scarred. "When you've been alone too long, you stop knowing what to do with kindness." She understood that. Kindness could be dangerous when you'd lived too long without it. It could make you remember things you had buried, warmth, laughter, the way another person's voice could steady your heartbeat. She had avoided it too, building walls around her heart like her ancestors built fences around their homes. It was safer to keep people outside than to risk letting them in. The cowboy stirred the coals with a stick, watching small sparks jump into the air. "I didn't mean to offend you earlier," he said quietly. "When I asked you that question, I just didn't know what else to say." She shook her head. "You didn't offend me." Her tone was even, but her eyes softened. "You surprised me. Most men don't ask for company, they take it. You asked." He looked at her, surprised by her honesty. "And you stayed." "I stayed," she said simply, "because I wanted to know what kind of man asks like that." She paused, studying him. "Now I think I know." He gave a small smile, barely visible in the dim light. "And what kind of man am I?" Her gaze didn't waver. "A broken one," she said, "but not beyond fixing." He looked down, her words both comforting and painful. It had been a long time since anyone had seen him that clearly. Most people looked at him and saw only a shadow, a man who'd spent too much time on the road, too much time running from his own ghosts. But she saw through the dust and the silence. She saw the man who still hoped for something, even if he didn't know what it was. They sat again in quiet, but this time it felt different. The silence wasn't heavy. It was alive, full of unspoken understanding. She reached for her pouch again and pulled out a small carved piece of wood, smooth and worn from being held often. She set it gently between them. "This is for protection," she said. "My mother gave it to me when I was a girl. She said it keeps your heart safe from things that mean to harm it." He stared at it, unsure. "You're giving it to me?" She shook her head. "I'm sharing it, only for tonight." He hesitated, then reached out, his fingers brushing the small charm. The wood was warm, alive somehow, like it remembered every hand that had held it before. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in that quiet he felt something shift inside him, a small crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. The woman watched him carefully. She didn't pity him. Pity was hollow, and she knew it could wound more than heal. What she felt was recognition. This man carried the same ache she did, just shaped differently. Both had lost things they could never get back. Both had learned to walk with the weight of silence. He opened his eyes again, his voice low. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "Miss what?" "Being held, being known." Her answer came slowly, as if she'd carried it for years. "Every day. But I learned that missing someone doesn't mean you need someone. Sometimes it just means you remember how it felt to belong." Her words sank deep into him. He swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in his throat. Belonging. It was such a simple word, yet it felt like something impossible. Out here, men belonged only to the land, and even that was borrowed. But her words made him wonder, what if belonging wasn't a place? What if it was a moment, or a person, or even just the sound of another heartbeat near yours? He didn't speak again for a long while. The stars above seemed brighter now, clearer. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain from far away. The woman leaned back slightly, her face turned toward the sky. "My mother used to say that every star is an ancestor," she murmured. "When you feel alone, you look up, and they remind you that you never truly are." He looked up too, following her gaze. The sky stretched forever, scattered with 1,000 lights that refused to die. "I haven't looked at the stars in years," he said. "Didn't seem much point." "There's always a point," she said. "You just forgot how to see it." Her words felt like a soft touch, a small reminder that maybe the world hadn't given up on him yet. He felt his chest tighten, but it wasn't pain, it was something else, something gentler. For the first time in years, he felt the quiet beat of hope, fragile but real. They stayed that way for a long time, two silhouettes framed by dying firelight and endless sky. No promises were made, no names exchanged. It wasn't about that. It was about being seen, about two hearts finding rest in the same silence. The fire flickered one last time before settling into a soft glow. The woman reached out and pushed the small wooden charm toward him. "Keep it until morning," she said. "It'll guard your dreams." He nodded, his voice low. "And what about yours?" She smiled faintly, her eyes glinting in the dark. "Maybe you'll guard mine." He didn't know how to answer that. So he didn't. He just looked at her, and for a moment the night didn't feel endless anymore. It felt whole. The air around them grew still, the stars above burning like silent witnesses, and somewhere deep in the heart of that vast, lonely land, two souls rested without saying another word. The first hint of dawn crept across the horizon, soft and gray, stretching its light over the sleeping earth. The night had passed quietly, though neither the cowboy nor the woman had truly slept. The fire had died sometime before morning, leaving behind only a bed of cool ash and the faint smell of smoke that clung to their clothes. The air was colder now, sharp enough to make breath visible. A few birds began to stir in the distance, their calls cutting through the silence like gentle reminders that another day had come whether they were ready or not. The cowboy sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. His back ached, his legs were stiff, but for the first time in years he didn't feel hollow. The ache in his chest that usually followed him like a ghost was quieter, almost still. He turned his head and saw her sitting a few feet away, her figure wrapped in a blanket, her gaze fixed on the pale line of sunrise growing across the plains. She looked peaceful, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life, the coming of light after a long, endless night. For a while he didn't speak. He just watched her, wondering what she was thinking, what she saw in the world that kept her strong. There was a kind of wisdom in her stillness, something ancient that didn't need words. He felt almost afraid to break the silence, as though doing so might shatter something sacred. But she turned her head slightly, sensing his eyes on her. A faint smile crossed her face, small but real. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. He shook his head. "Didn't want to," he admitted. "Didn't want to miss the morning." Her smile deepened a little, just enough to show she understood. She reached down and stirred the ashes with a stick, watching a small wisp of smoke rise and vanish into the air. "Morning always comes," she said, "even when you don't think it will." The cowboy looked out at the horizon. The land stretched wide, an endless, golden light slowly spilling over the hills. It was beautiful, but it also felt like goodbye. He knew the road waited for him. The trail never ended for men like him. It only curved and faded into new places, new silences. He wanted to say something meaningful, something that might hold onto the night they had shared, but the words wouldn't come. He had spent so many years speaking only to his horse and the wind that his tongue had forgotten how to shape gratitude. The woman stood, folding her blanket neatly and tucking it under her arm. She moved with quiet purpose, graceful and sure, as though she belonged to the morning itself. She glanced toward him once, her eyes steady. "You'll be leaving soon," she said. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "That's the way of things," he murmured. "Always moving, always chasing the next sunrise." "Do you ever stop?" she asked. He thought about it, staring at the dirt between his boots. "If I stop," he said softly, "I'll have to feel everything I've run from." She watched him for a long moment. Then she walked closer, her footsteps light against the earth. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost tender. "You can't run forever," she said. "Even the wind has to rest." Her words hit something deep in him. He looked up at her, really looking this time. The first light of morning touched her face, making her eyes glow like the edges of a river at dawn. He wanted to tell her that maybe, for the first time in years, he didn't want to run. That maybe he'd found something in her presence that made him feel grounded, human. But he couldn't. Words had never been his gift. All he could do was look at her and hope she understood. She reached into her pouch again and pulled out the small wooden charm she had given him the night before. It dangled from a thin string, smooth and simple. She held it out to him, her fingers steady. "You kept it safe," she said. He nodded. "It did its job, no bad dreams." Her lips curved faintly. "Then it worked." She took the charm back and slipped it into her pouch. The gesture was gentle, almost ritualistic. It felt final, yet not unkind. He wanted to ask her to keep it or to make him one of his own, something to remind him that this night had been real. But before he could speak, she said, "You'll remember without it." He tilted his head. "You think so?" She nodded. "Not with your mind," she said. "With your heart." The simplicity of her words silenced him. He lowered his eyes, the weight of her meaning settling quietly in his chest. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and wild sage. The woman turned toward the hills, where the path back to her village lay. The cowboy followed her gaze. Two roads stretched before them now, hers leading home, his leading nowhere in particular. He stood slowly, dusting off his coat, feeling the stiffness in his body. He tightened the strap of his saddle, the familiar sound of leather creaking filling the still air. The woman watched, her expression unreadable. There was no sadness there, no longing. Just acceptance, like the calm before the first rain. When he finally faced her again, he felt something rise in his throat that wasn't quite sorrow but wasn't peace either. He tipped his hat slightly, a small gesture of respect. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the fire, for the company, for staying." She nodded once. "Thank you for asking," she replied. "Most people don't." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and ache. "I hope you find peace," he said. "I already have," she answered. Then she turned and began to walk away, her figure moving slowly across the open field, her shape growing smaller with every step. The cowboy watched until she was nothing more than a shadow against the brightening sky. The morning light caught on his face, showing the lines of a man who had lived too many years in silence, but finally remembered what it meant to be seen. He climbed onto his horse, the leather saddle groaning beneath him. For a moment he hesitated. The path stretched ahead, familiar and empty, but something inside him had changed. The world didn't feel as cruel now, nor the road as lonely. He took one last look at the horizon where she had disappeared, and for the first time in a long time he whispered something. Not a prayer, not a promise, just a simple truth meant for no one but himself. Then, with a gentle nudge, his horse began to move. The morning sun spilled over the land, washing the world in gold, and as the cowboy rode away, the sound of hooves faded into the wind, carrying with it the quiet memory of a night that neither of them would ever forget.